بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين وعلى أصحابه بجهودهم قام هذا الدين رضي الله عنهم أجمعين ثم أما بعد. In this session we will reflect upon the hadith which is narrated in the Riyadh Salihin of Imam Nawawi rahmatullahi alayhi. The hadith is found in Babul Mujahada, the chapter which deals with self-cultivation and reformation. The hadith is translated according to its implications, so that the meanings and the content of the hadith are communicated, the content and meanings which are necessary in order to understand the objectives of the hadith and what it means and what's to educate us in or about. Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, he related this hadith in his Riyadh Salihin without a chain of transmission, but we see that the ulama of hadith have noted that the hadith is narrated in Bukhari and Muslim. So it is a hadith which is of a strong grade. As a matter of fact, it is a hadith which is of the strongest grades. He relates قال عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال أن هجبت النار بالشهوات وهجبت الجنة بالمكاره متفق عليه. وفي رواية لمسلم حفت بدل هجبت وهو بمعناه أي بينه وبينها هذا الحجاب فإذا فعله دخلها. أخرجه البخاري ومسلم. وفي رواية ثانية عند مسلم من حديث أنس رضي الله عنه. In this hadith is simply translated as hell is enveloped or veiled by desire, and Jannah is enveloped by that which is taxing. But if we look at the translation here, we went into a little more depth. The abode of hell is enveloped by a veil of desire, and the abode of heaven is enveloped by a veil of duty and obligation, demanding spiritual, emotional, physical, and intellectual training. The hadith finds its origin in Bukhari and Muslim. Interesting enough, Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, he relates this hadith in Babul Mujahada. If we pay attention to the way that the ulama of hadith classify a hadith, then we can get an insight into the methodology of Imam Nawawi rahimahullah. And in contextualizing this hadith in the chapter of Mujahada, or the chapter of self-reformation and cultivation, we find that Imam Nawawi rahimahullah is interpreting this hadith as essential to that task. The task of self-reformation, self-reform, meaning looking at oneself and identifying that which is necessary to be changed, because it is that either which goes against the Sharia or that which leads us to go against the Sharia. So here Imam Nawawi rahimahullah is teaching us a psychology of depth, and that is that the Muslim should understand the demands of the Sharia and the demands of the Islamic orientation as far as personality is concerned, as well as understanding the unique features of oneself, what one inclines to. And with that knowledge, make an effort to transform the self so that it is elevated, not to destroy the personality that we call you or me, but to reform it and refine it. Because it is true that personality will incline to one thing, and we find that when that personality is compared to another, that there's an inclination in a different direction. Personalities, in other words, vary in degree and temperament and so on and so forth. But Imam Nawawi rahimahullah is teaching us that if we want to transform ourselves, then we have to come to understand ourselves. And this is essential knowledge. That we understand the deficiencies that we have and the motivations which motivate those deficiencies. And that in itself is a task. But fundamentally, the two paths which are laid out for the human being are the path to the abode of the hellfire and the path which leads to the abode which we call heaven. These two realities are there, manifest, created. They are real and exist. That is the belief of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. That Jannah and Jahannam exist at the moment. Interestingly enough, Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, in quoting this hadith in Babul Mujahada, draws our attention to the contents. The hellfire is veiled or enveloped by our desires. Desire fundamentally is rooted in the senses, so that the senses of the human being arouse desire if left without maintaining balance. So we find that the eye can lead to the cultivation of cravings in the stomach. When the eye is not trained, we find that the eye, for instance, when we talk about food, people begin to eat with their eyes before they eat with their mouths and stomachs. And we know in our biology that digestion begins in the eye and in the intellect before it begins in the mouth. And it continues to take place in the intellect and in the stomach. This is the same when we talk about the reality of approaching a good deed or approaching a bad deed or approaching a deed which is punishable or a deed which is rewarded, or simply put, that which is pleasing to Allah or that which does not win the favor of Allah, which we call sin. That reality begins before engaging the action. It begins in the eye and in the intellect. And when the intellect, as Hume said, the philosopher from England, is the slave to the passions, he believed that intellect is always the slave of the passions. When intellect is undermined and desire is strong, then be assured that the reality of the hadith is manifesting itself. And that's that desire, in this case, leads us to Jahannam. When it is uncontrolled, when it enslaves the intellect, when it overwhelms the body, when it overwhelms ourselves. So desire of all sorts, when left unchecked and outside of a state of balance, lead us to that path which is destruction. Jannah, on the other hand, or heaven, is enveloped, is veiled by acts which require the discipline of the self. And when we speak of discipline of the self, we speak of seeking and achieving a balance in relating to ourselves. We're not talking about monasticism, and we're not talking about denial of the world. We're talking about living in balance as was the way of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there's difficulty in the path of Jannah because it requires at times a transformation of our desire and our inclination to that which is destructive. So when the self is undisciplined and overridden by emotion and desire, lust, then the intellect cannot survive in its own identity and with strength. So we see even the very body of the self, even our very flesh, begins to rebel against us and drag us into a pit of fire, a state in which we begin to self-implode emotionally. And we see this. When desire is allowed to reign, when emotion is allowed to reign without restriction, we find that some people begin to have self-pity to the point of possibly even treading the path either of suicide or depression. When intellect doesn't bring in a balanced judgment for emotion, then emotion overrides us, and the end result of that is a lack of spiritual and mental health. When we indulge in feelings of negativity, those very feelings contribute to our state of a lack of contentment with life and a lack of experiencing well-being. And those very emotions have an impact on our physical reality and our physical condition. But when we discipline ourselves and when we implement within ourselves those principles which are necessary to carry out the ordinances of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, which allow us to be free from desire, we begin to taste the sweetness of Iman. Because we begin to experience the reality of Jannah in our very lives, even if it only in an opaque form. The sweetness of Iman is that which allows us foretaste to what will come for those who Allah will grant Jannah. And the reality of desire left unchecked is to live hell on earth. To live hell on earth. So the senses, my brothers and sisters, are the gateway either to our development and cultivation or to our self-destruction. Or to our self-destruction. And the reason why many of us fall into desire without restriction is because Shaitan manifests in desire beauty. And the human being is inclined to that which is good, that which is beautiful. So the only way that the human being will be tricked to falling into the realities of the hellfire is that reality of the hellfire is veiled by that which is beautiful or that which we incline toward or incline to. So without proper judgment and measurement, it is easy to interpret a matter other than what it is. It is easy to fall into those states which open us up to addiction, which open us up to the decrease of our Iman, because we're looking to be happy. We're looking to be happy. We're looking for contentment. We're looking for the good. We're looking for the beautiful. This is the reality of our fitrah, that our fitrah, our nature understands the purpose of life. The human being was created in good. The human being was created in justice. The human being was created to incline toward light. And there may be some things which the human being dislikes, but in those very things, there is a great good and there is plenty of benefit. And this is the path of Jannah. That Jannah requires of us to stop and think and see, because that very action which requires of us discipline may be the action which we reject and are overcome by desire. And we find this when we talk about salah, how we can go through phases in which the salah is easy for us, and then in phases we find ourselves in which we rather sit around and speak, and salah almost becomes something that is detestable to us. And then we drown in that chatter that is empty, in critique, and in finding faults. And then we find that even salah is heavy. Those are the states in which we find that we have to develop ourselves. And then there are those moments in which we find that we struggle with the self, and we pray the salah, and we find that we do the dhikr after the salah, and we find contentment and ease, tranquility. Just an example of the reality of when we try to maintain balance in our lives. That ease that we are searching for is there before our very eyes, if only we just attune ourselves to it. Jannah is surrounded by the necessity of putting desire in check, and that takes work, and it is exhausting. And Jahannam is surrounded by a false ease and a false sense of pleasure, which only leads to deepening our destruction, or our feelings of depression, or feelings of negativity, or thinking which is cyclical, which traps us into only seeing bad in the world. Jahannam, it's a trap which is surrounded by acts which may seem and appear to be right, and are acts which vibe with our very desires. And Jannah requires of us to put on our thinking kufis and pay attention before we fall into a pit of self-destruction. May Allah guide us.